Well, this is shaping up to be a big, big week in the history of this whole Wu flu pandemic that we're living through. This next week I'm talking about, of course, because it seems like that we're going to see a change in narrative for the first time. And I'm not talking about government narrative, I mean in the narrative of history. Because so far, this pandemic has been a story of the virus on the ascendance, spreading across the world, and most notably over the last few weeks or months, it's been a story of how governments have progressively across the world clamped down on their populations, clamped down on freedom of movement, and beyond just infringing upon basic civil liberties, they have been suppressing the economies of their nations, which have made it pretty difficult for basic society to continue functioning. We see massive breadlines in the United States, for example. However many millions unemployed at this point, I've lost track. I think it's about 28 million. People who have lost their jobs since all this started. Folks who are told that they cannot work and have absolutely no way of making a living. And as this has gone on, things have gotten worse and worse, and more people have had to be laid off or fired or whatever. And there's been no hope that any of this is going to turn the tide until, well, now this week. It seems like things are actually starting to change. The first major milestone, of course, being the state of Georgia, which is supposed to, be reopening and getting back to business somewhat, or at least they're loosening the restrictions. See, to me, that's the very important thing. It's not necessarily the intensity of what's being done in all these states, but it's the direction that they're moving, because that, it's part of the winds of history. Once things get moving in a certain direction, you can't stop them. And so it's a very depressing time, when all these lockdowns are intensifying, because that just gives you more and more room for things to get worse and worse. But once you hit rock bottom, which it seems that we have, and I talked about this over the last couple of weeks, that from a societal standpoint, these lockdowns can only be sustained for so long before everything breaks, and then the tide will begin to turn. And so we see not just Georgia switching and changing their tune and moving in a direction towards opening up. We see Texas and plenty of other U.S. states, and also countries that have been hit by this so badly. Places like Spain. Spain is a notable one because it's not exactly a particularly rich country as far by European standards, and they don't have the ability to just print money to pay for everything like the U.S. thinks that it can, because Spain is on the euro, and the euro is controlled by the European Central Bank, not by some Spanish central bank, and so they're in real trouble right now with this whole lockdown. They as a country cannot afford to do all this. But of course, the U.S. can't really afford to do it either. It's just that we're pretty good at fooling ourselves into thinking that we can just, by printing money, sustain our economy. You might be able to sustain it on paper, but all those things that are not being produced, they're still not going to be produced if you have nobody working. That's why I've been pretty confident that the lockdowns were going to change. Up until this point. Now we're starting to see that. And so this will be the moment of truth, because will we see a second wave of infection? Will we suddenly see a massive new spike this week as these different states and countries, Spain, even Italy, I think Italy is supposed to open on May 1st. And of course, all these different localities, they're opening to different, to varying extents. Like Texas is opening, for example, in multiple phases. And phase 1 of that, I believe, is supposed to open today, to where retail stores are allowed to operate, but on some kind of like a to-go basis, to where they bring, you come in or you come to the front of the store and say what you want, and they can bring you what you want, and then you pay and you leave, or something like that, I guess. But just no real shopping inside of a retail space. But other places are moving more quickly, and I guess with all the good thing is, with all this variation, we'll get a good feel as to it's a good level of experimentation, so we'll see, where things work out well and where things don't. Hopefully, we don't have a big second wave anywhere. The best case scenario here would be that, Georgia, which seems to be, the most aggressive in reopening, that everything goes fine there, and that things don't get out of hand. But I'm still very worried about that. I've been trying to be optimistic. I've been trying to build up my optimism over the last few weeks because, again, anyone who's been listening to me since this all started knows that I was very concerned since January about all this, and that I did not think that this is a particularly good virus that you could just shrug off. In fact, the state of New York now is reporting that they've got about 13 or 14% of the population that they think have already had this virus based on the antibody tests, and that, of course, 13% is not herd immunity. It's very far from it. Herd immunity would be something like 80%. And again, I shouldn't even necessarily say that, because there's plenty of reason to believe that you can't achieve herd immunity with a virus like this, because multiple infections seem to be possible. And so just because you've had this virus and recovered doesn't necessarily mean that you won't get it again. Which also means that that big vaccine that Bill Gates wants to forcibly stab into your arm might not do you any good either, because if recovering from this virus after having it doesn't give you immunity, well, then a vaccine wouldn't either. So we don't know necessarily how bad things are going to be or how much worse things can get by opening up. But what we do know, here's what we absolutely do know, is that staying shut down, it means, total destruction for our society. This is not something that you can, plenty of people made this analogy, but it's not just like a faucet that you can turn off. You can't just turn off the economy for a couple weeks and then turn it back on and expect everything to come back. You can't just cut everyone free checks for free money and tell them, go to the store and pay stuff and buy stuff, whatever you need, because the stuff that people need has to be produced. People have to get that money from somewhere. If you just, for example, printed money and mailed everybody a check every week for whatever their expenses are, well, then, and you tell them, hey, there's only a couple stores open, and then everybody has all this money, they go out and spend it, what happens? You get massive hyperinflation. The government knows this. That's why the government isn't giving everyone the money that they need to survive. They're just letting them, not starve, but, really, really, really struggle. Because they know if you just increase the money supply against, while reducing the national product substantially by shutting everything down, well, then, there's the only way that the market can adjust for that is through price, and nobody wants that. Now, though, because we're getting to this point to where people are feeling so much pain, to where people are getting so desperate, to where you're seeing people go out in the streets and protest and things like that, the only option left is to try and ease the restrictions. And yes, that does mean that the virus will start spreading more rapidly again. But, you get to a point to where you just don't have much of an option left but to allow that to happen. I'm not saying that's a good thing. There's a lot of non-nuanced people who, don't have to work for a living, I assume, who, like to pontificate about how anyone who dares question, the length of these lockdowns or whatever, or dares criticize anyone wearing a lab coat, they would consider you to be subhuman. But, like I said, no matter how much people protest now, it's funny. When the lockdowns were starting, the conventional wisdom was in the opposite direction, that this virus is not a big deal. That was the conventional wisdom. Now that the conventional wisdom is the virus is terrible, and that we all have to stay inside forever and never work and never earn any money, and we're all going to go broke, and that's exactly how things should be, or else we're all going to die. Basically, you have a choice between starving or you have a choice between dying of this virus. And if you choose dying of this virus over starving, you are an absolute idiot. And so, you should get the idea that, conventional wisdom is not forward-looking, it's backward-looking. So let's hope then that, given that the zeitgeist is moving away from the lockdowns, that won't be too detrimental. Even Andrew Cuomo now thinks that that we've kind of, in New York, not that I live in New York, but I mean, the people of New York, he and them, they've rounded the bend, so to speak. That they are on the mend, that they've passed their peak. This is, pretty positive news. But again, based on, with the data that he released, that only 13% of people, are have had this virus so far based on the antibody tests. That to me does not seem to indicate that you've rounded the bend, because that's nowhere near any idea of herd immunity, if herd immunity is even attainable. It may just be that, as some people have been speculating, that this is going to be a new seasonal disease that people just have to deal with, just like the flu. And if that's the case, if this is really going to come by every year, what are we going to do? Are we going to shut down our economies every year for 6 months out of the year while this season is going on of whatever this virus is? I don't think anybody has any plan as far as that's concerned. So with that said, if you gain anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.